I remember I walked into my bedroom and told my wife Annette back in June of 2003 I was going to put out a news release calling on the state legislature to put on the ballot a marriage protection amendment to our state constitution in response to the Ontario Supreme Court having legalized and redefined marriage to mean something other than between a man and a woman, and to prevent people involved in that particular type of relationship from going across the bridge and getting married in Canada, coming back over and filing a lawsuit to have that recognized here in Michigan. We called for a marriage protection amendment to the state constitution. I was one of the two people that co-authored it, and now it's in front of the United States Supreme Court. Here's how far the court has to go not to uphold the vote of 2.7 million voters. Just 3 years ago, the court ruled in the Windsor case that it was doing away with the federal definition of marriage between a man and a woman, specifically because historically it had been the purview and the authority of the states to define what a marriage is and what it isn't. So in order for them to overturn the vote of the people of Michigan, they'd have to ignore their own precedent of just 3 years ago. Even more recently, they ruled in the University of Michigan affirmative action case that the judiciary should give great deference and respect to actual votes of the people. Not elected representatives, but the people themselves. The 2.7 million Michigan voters who voted to put the marriage amendment in our state constitution. The justices even went so far as to say in their ruling that it would be demeaning to democracy to say that any issue was so controversial and complex that the people themselves were not capable of rationally and intelligently judging it, researching it, and reaching a rational decision. So the court is going to have to reverse or ignore two of their own most recent precedents in order to overturn the vote of 2.7 million voters. Does that mean I have any confidence that they won't reach up into the air and ignore everything they did and create some new right that we know is not found in the Constitution? No, I have no such confidence. The broader question, and I think one that applies to this issue and a lot of others, is do 5 unelected lawyers, the least accountable branch of our federal government, do they even have the legitimate constitutional authority to tell the states and the executive branch and the legislative branch and the legislatures of 50 states and tens of millions of voters what marriage is and is not? I don't think they do. Abraham Lincoln said in his first inaugural address, he was talking about the Dred Scott decision, which, by the way, as president, he simply ignored, refused to enforce it. The decision that said a black man or a black woman is not a citizen of the United States, therefore has no constitutional protection. The president, rightfully exercising his constitutional authority, ignored the decision or the opinion of the co-equal branch of government. And Lincoln said in his first inaugural address that if we ever reach the point in this country where the Supreme Court issues a decision and it applies to every American in every state all at once, then we no longer have a free government. But is that not where we find ourselves today?
Absolutely.
30 states, by an average voter margin in excess of 60%, have defined marriage in their state constitutions as only between one man and one woman. And yet we face the prospect in June of 5 unelected lawyers, the least accountable branch of our government, never faces accountability to the voters, saying that 2.7 million voters in Michigan and tens of millions of voters across this country and the legislative branches and the executive branches, they're all wrong. We 5 lawyers know better. The only encouraging thing I heard from the oral arguments back in April was Justice Kennedy, who is expected to be the swing vote, saying it would be very difficult for the court to just say, we know better than everybody else who's taken a stand on this issue. I hope that's the case. But this is not just a question of defining marriage. It is a much broader threat to our religious freedom. Look at what happened last year in Houston when pastors dared speak out against a local gay rights ordinance. What did the mayor and the city attorney do? Subpoenaed their sermons. If you look, as one of the previous speakers said, if you want to see what's happening in the future in America, look over to Europe and see where pastors are jailed for preaching sermons in which they teach traditional Judeo-Christian philosophy on the question of what is and is not marriage. The state of Oklahoma just recently passed a piece of legislation that is almost embarrassing in how narrow its scope is. It simply said that pastors cannot be forced to officiate at marriage ceremonies for something other than between one man and one woman. It passed overwhelmingly, but the activist groups that want to redefine marriage announced that they will challenge it in court. Do we need any bigger or brighter red flag waving as to their intentions when they plan to challenge in court a bill that does nothing except say pastors can't be compelled to officiate homosexual marriage ceremonies? We need to understand that this is going to be a threat to our religious freedom.